Celebrating 75 years, the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, shaping the next 75 years of work.
I'm Harry Katz. I serve as director of the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution at the ILR School, Cornell University. This is one in a series of interviews we're doing with individuals who are conflict resolvers, and we're asking them how their work and the process of their work has been affected by the pandemic. We're interviewing individuals who have a connection to the Scheinman Institute, either through their service on the board of advisors, or possibly they also teach in one of our professional development programs. Today, I'm pleased to be talking with Ken Kirschner, who's a management side advocate. He's a lawyer who advocates for management in various labor and work employment matters, the substance of which we'll get into. So Ken, let me just sort of jump into it and just ask how your work and others in your firm has changed because of the pandemic, sort of the nature of the cases or the conflicts or the disputes where you're facing. Has the pandemic changed them in any way?
Yes, Harry, there's no question that there's more layoffs, unfortunately, more furloughs, discharges, leave situations, sick pay disputes than there were before. I mean, it's the nature of the increase in unemployment that has dramatically increased some of the disputes and the nature of those disputes. It's also a lot tougher to resolve some of those cases because the unemployment was so high and continues to be very high. So people are correctly concerned about getting reemployment. And so the nature and resolution of these cases are taking longer and tougher to resolve. I think also in terms of bargaining, negotiations, and arbitrations, they're for some reason taking longer to schedule, and many contracts seem to be extended or expire, and hopefully the parties will get together and negotiate them after this COVID crisis is over.
So you've talked interestingly about the effects of the recession and the layoffs that are caused by the pandemic. I'm also curious as to whether there are more health and safety issues coming forward, whether someone's got adequate protection, or what happens if they feel that they can't return to work, and do they get health care benefits and the like. Are those kinds of issues also surfacing?
Absolutely. And it all really depends upon the industry. Certainly in meat packing and others, there are tremendous concerns and have been an extensive amount of issues in litigation involving some of those industries. I also think that as people come back to traveling and staying in hotels, there's going to be a lot more litigation and concern from people, particularly in the hospitality industry. And we've certainly seen it in the healthcare and education areas of concern for safety, for social distancing, and just making sure that people can come to work safely every day.
So when those kinds of issues surface, is it inevitable that there's conflict over them, or is it that there's different kind of just discussions about possible solutions, or is it kind of a mixture? Some aspects of those disputes are conflictual, but in some other ways on health and safety and personal protection. The firms have an interest in the health and safety of their employees and protecting them and doing the right thing. So it must be kind of a mixed bag of conflict as well as cooperation over those issues.
Absolutely. I mean, there's never enough that you can do to protect everyone. And so, some people are naturally think that more and more can be done. Whether you have to use 2 or 3 masks or versus 1 mask, and how many you get, all those kinds of issues are certainly workers have raised those types of concerns. Same thing with partitions and the amount of space and things like that. when you have an assembly line and that assembly line was built many years ago, it's difficult necessarily to not have people right next to each other. But then you could put up plastic or do other things to accommodate those concerns. And you're right, Harry. It's been a mixed bag as to whether we work in cooperation or in conflict.
Yeah, so I would assume part of your role is at times to mediate as well as to sort of represent management and organizations in disputes that turn conflictual in nature.
Absolutely. It's been a big part of the job for quite some time.
So let's talk about how the work is actually occurring, given that we're all doing so much more work virtually. How's that changed what you do and others in your firm do? I mean, what are the sort of pluses and minuses of working in this virtual environment?
I think basically everyone has gone virtual, and there's no going back to that, number one. Number two, I think the minuses, let me start with the minuses. I think in negotiations and mediations, there's a natural rhythm to, offers and counter offers, going back and forth, kibitzing among the people, joking, sometimes yelling and screaming, hopefully not too often. And the virtual communication has kind of lost that. And in my mind, we've lost some of the enthusiasm that you have in face-to-face negotiations, arbitrations, or mediations. And it's tough when everybody is in a different location to get that enthusiasm, get that drive to, let's settle this matter. Right
so
now.
Just to pick up on that before, I know there's other things you want to get to, but I know when I teach my students about negotiations, I say to them, look, there's often a lot of informal sidebar conversations that are going on that are really healthy, where key negotiators are meeting away from the table and they can kind of try and actually resolve things and then bring it to the table and all. And, I would think that some of that is limited by the virtual technology, that you can't just run into someone while you're getting coffee or out in the bathroom or just outside in the corridor and think about how you could creatively solve the problem.
Absolutely. I mean, you do have virtual lobbies and other rooms that you can separate into, but it's just not the same as being in the same place at the same time. And seeking out someone who has a disagreement and trying to negotiate with your own side as to whether or not we can move forward on a particular issue. And I think that it does lose something in the process. I think
so I interrupted you. Go ahead. You were talking as well about some other negatives beyond just the difficulties in the nature and the pace of the give and take of negotiation.
Yeah, I think also though, as a litigator, for example, in an arbitration, you do lose the element of surprise in an arbitration or a deposition when you have to give your exhibits in advance to be in the queue so that they know they can get them. It used to be, that you can just give somebody a document and say, have you ever seen this before? Is that your signature on it? But now they're going to have the ability to read it in advance and see it. So there's not the same type of Perry Mason, I got you kinds of things that I've seen previously in other settings. I think one of the pluses, obviously, to virtual is the fact that, costs are much less. Transportation is non-existent in most instances. And the fact of the matter is, it's really the only game in town. I think even with that, there are some clients who are still reluctant to engage in the virtual and want face-to-face negotiations, arbitrations, litigations, and we just keep postponing these cases, and ultimately there's going to be a cost.
Right. So you're saying there's when we finally see the end of the pandemic, there'll be a backlog of some of these cases that the parties didn't want for one reason or another didn't want to address, and they're going to address them once things return to face to face.
Absolutely.
Other things that have been mentioned in our discussions with other parties involved is on the plus side, they've said, I'm curious about whether it's come up for you too, is they say, well, one advantage is you could bring in the decision maker, especially on the management side, whether it's the CEO or the chief financial officer or the head of an operation, whereas in face to face, it'd be more difficult to schedule them, and it may be logistically difficult. Just they're at a distance. But now with using Zoom or some other technology, you can Zoom them in for 10 or 15 minutes. Have you actually found that surfacing?
Gee, I would hope in the past that person would always be available by phone, and so I always felt I had that regardless of whether we were doing virtual or in person. Because if you don't have that authority at the tip of your fingers, you really can't cut the deal. And so it may be better to have a person on Zoom than on a phone call, but I've felt that it's not critical one way or the other, whether they're on a video versus phone.
Yeah. So what about dealing with a witness? There's also been some concerns I've heard from people that not being in the same room with them to watch their body language, or even just, again, maybe the element of surprise too, would be to ask them a question and see how they respond that they didn't expect. It's a little bit different, whereas in Zoom, you just don't get their true reaction, or it's hidden. Has that come up in your dealings?
Absolutely. I do think there is a big difference between, cross-examining somebody over the Zoom versus in person. And there's, tricks that we've learned over the years about how to cross-examine someone, and when you have a pause and when you don't have a pause, when you show them the exhibit, the timing of when you show the exhibit. Those kinds of things you can't control anymore with virtual depositions or virtual arbitrations. And so it has changed, and you have to think a lot more about how to do those cross-examinations.
So let's talk about how things are evolving now that we're at a kind of a different stage in the pandemic, where it's now, some people are returning to work, and then we also have vaccinations coming on stream. Have the issues the substance of the issues changed as we're moving into this different phase?
Yeah, first of all, I think the nature of work has changed since the beginning. Let's put aside the vaccinations for a while. I mean, waiters are doing deliveries now, and people are doing a lot of different things that they weren't asked to do. So there are many things in terms of changes that have occurred that I think labor and management have had to deal with, that this COVID crisis has changed dramatically the way people work. I'm not a doctor, obviously, but I do understand that you could still be a carrier if you are vaccinated. And no one also knows how long you're immune for, whatever period, if you are vaccinated. So do I think that this is still going to be a concern for a number of years? Absolutely. And I do think it will change the nature of how we work and how we perform.
Let's just turn to the vaccination question. You said, appropriately, you separated that from the others. What do you anticipate there? Are you going to face issues about people refusing to be vaccinated, or claiming they have religious or other reasons not to be vaccinated? And how's that going to surface?
Right. Well, I hope, except maybe in the healthcare and education, I'm hoping that most employers are going to be recommending and not requiring it. If they do require it, obviously there has to be religious and disability accommodation for that. But I think most of them, the employers, are recognizing that some people fear the COVID-19, but some people also fear taking shots. And so I think the vast majority will agree to take them, but I'm hopeful that most employers are going to agree, with the admonition that many of the precautions are going to continue. And so I believe that if a person's not going to be vaccinated, we're still going to be wearing masks and we're still going to be social distancing.
So I've also heard that some organizations are considering making it easy for their employees to get vaccinated. Bringing vaccinations on site, so not making it mandatory as you're speculating, but just relying essentially on ease and peer pressure, where there'll be a clinic, basically run within. This would likely be larger organizations, but you're in a factory, and you say to people, okay, you can take time off paid for by the company to go off and spend 15, 20 minutes, get vaccinated. Have you heard organizations discussing that?
Yeah, I just saw the one that's going to offer 4 hours of pay to get vaccinated to anyone who does get vaccinated within the organization. And so I think that there are doing incentives to do that and paying for it and paying for the time to get it. So I think those are all very positive measures on the part of employers.
So let's speculate a bit about what you already touched on. I just want to delve on it a little bit further, is kind of what's going to happen when the vaccine is under greater control. You're mentioning we may not have 100% control, and we're also still worried about how long the vaccination immunity lasts. But what about the use of the virtual technology? Are we going to see more things occurring virtually than before? Are we going to return to the previous way? You've already mentioned how many of the litigations and arbitrations and maybe even some negotiations got delayed, and so obviously those are going to occur. But what about even the things that were successfully carried out through virtual technology? Is the use of virtual going to persist for those at least?
I think absolutely, and I see that not only in the arbitration mediation, but in the court system as well. I think whereas many judges would require you to be in their court, in their chambers, they're not going to want to do that anymore. And so if the judiciary is not going to be doing it, then the quasi-judiciary, the arbitrators, the ALJs who, with the Department of Labor and others, will be doing it virtually as well. And I think that's positive if it accommodates the people's desires and also it makes it more user-friendly.
So just bringing it home to your law firm, are you going to have lawyers, who are working some of the week at home virtually and some of the office? I mean, people always did a bit of that before. It's not that none of us ever were connected to the internet, but is there going to be kind of a step change in just the way lawyers work?
I think the genie is out of the bottle. I think it's going to be difficult to get people to come back into the office under the same circumstances. I think how people dress in the future is going to be different. Whether they take public transportation or not is going to be very different going forward. And so I do think there's going to be a tremendous change of people coming into offices, going into factories or retail stores, and so there's going to be some dramatic changes with respect to how people work in the future.
And we've covered a lot of ground, so I just want to give you a chance to sort of think about whether there's issues that have come up through the pandemic, either about the nature of the work or about the process that we haven't touched on that you think are affecting your work.
I think there's one thing, Harry, that we didn't touch on, which is it used to be that many of us considered coming to work was an essential function of the job. And so if someone didn't want to come to work anymore and said, I'm not going to be there, I'll continue to work at home, we said, no, that is an essential function. Dealing with your peers, being at meetings, doing all those other things that the camaraderie of an office or a factory or whatever was necessary. And I think it's going to be very difficult to make that argument going forward for many management and attorneys to say, Why can't it be done at home? Why can't I participate in that meeting virtually? And so I think we might lose that argument about someone who does refuse once we come back to quote unquote whatever is normal in the future.
I think that probably especially true in cases like yourself, where you work in New York City, where the commute, could for some people is an hour and a half, and it's often through public transportation. It's hard. As I've walked around Manhattan, it's hard for me to imagine how the core part of it is going to come back. And I guess that's consistent with what you're also saying. In your firm, you think it's unlikely everybody's going to come back.
That's right. And I think a lot of people will have a lot of extra real estate in terms of going forward.
Yeah. So it's a good question of what's going to happen to those business towers, and are they going to turn into residents or something else? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Anything else that we haven't covered that you want to touch on? I know we've covered a lot of ground.
I think that's it, Harry. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, and thanks again for all that you do for the Scheinman Institute for ILR in Cornell. Take care.
Take care.